It's been a long time coming, but I'm finally doing a full review on the eDrum 3CS trigger. I'll be giving you in-depth detail on trigger response, the design and installation, communications with eDrum themselves, and my final verdict on whether or not you should buy it. Let's get to it. Hey, Luke here at the eDrum Workshop. Welcome back and I hope you're having a great day. If this is your first time here and you want to know how to get the best out of your electronic or hybrid drums, hit that subscribe button and the bell so you don't miss any news, reviews or discussions. I've been using the eDrum 3CS trigger inside my 13-inch snare for a good while now. I put out a first impressions video back in December. If you've already seen that video, there will be a little bit of crossover here. I'm going to be going back over the ordering process, the design and the installation, so feel free to jump to the timestamp on the screen, but I will be going into a fair bit more detail this time round, so you might still get something out of it. So eDrum are a small company from Italy. They have a few trigger options available, from a standard center cone trigger on a crossbar, a side mount trigger, or even center cones or 3 cones on these non-destructive 3-arm mounts. They also do cymbal triggers on low volume cymbals, a cowbell, timbales, and they even have their own hi-hat controller. They don't currently have their website set up for ordering products directly, so there was a couple of days of email communications about placing the order. I initially heard about eDrum and their 3-cone designs from a Facebook group back in maybe May 2019, and I think back then they were still in the design and testing phase. Then in November 2019, Digital Drummer magazine put out a review of the trigger and it re-entered my periphery. So I went onto eDrum's Facebook page and I dropped them a message where I was directed to email them to complete the order. The full ordering process to delivery took about 2 weeks. Opening communication about the order, getting the shipping quote and paying, and then waiting while they source the parts because all the triggers are made to order. There was a few emails back and forth about the exact diameter of my shell and what jack input option I wanted, and then the trigger was shipped. From Italy to the UK, this took about 5 days or so because it crossed over a weekend. I was completely fine with all of this. I'm pretty aware that this appears to be a one-person operation, and with a presumably small volume of orders, they can't just have everything pre-made and ready to go. If you happen to be in a hurry, this might not be the best option for you, but personally, I'd always take careful communication and making sure we're getting it right when placing an order like this. There's plenty of other companies around already offering off-the-shelf solutions. Upon arrival, the trigger was packed well enough for me, a decent-sized reused box with enough padding to keep everything in place. Inside the box was the trigger, some parts to help with installation, and also a drum key holder to place on a hi-hat stand with a little Merry Christmas message, which I thought was lovely. I won't spend too long on the build and construction. I went into that quite a bit on the first impressions video. Feel free to go back and check that out if you want to know more. But the quick version is that it's incredibly well built. The design is completely non-destructive. You don't need to take anything off your drum other than the heads to install it. And it's only really the exposed wires that had me a little bit worried, but that's because I'm pretty clumsy. You get provided with these plastic mounts to place under the bearing edge of your drum that sets the appropriate height. You place the trigger upside down on these mounts, spaced equally apart. Then you just adjust the screws to push the legs outwards into the shell to lock it into place. The ends of each leg has a rubber pad on the end so it doesn't do any damage to your shells, and they compress enough to get a really tight lock into your drum. Personally, I opted to take the barrel jack connector because I've already removed the vent hole from my drum for a different DIY project. But they do their own custom jack box that can mount over any standard vent hole and feed through with a slim cable. The jack input connects to the trigger with a 3.5mm mini jack. This makes it really easy to connect and disconnect, and once again means you can easily install and remove the entire trigger without additional tools or taking any hardware off the shell. This is all really simple to use and it's a really clean and tidy design. The entire thing is really well thought out. So now that's covered, onto the performance. I first tested this with my Roland TD50 and then later I tested it with my Pearl Mimic Pro. So I'm going to go into the trigger response in that order. When I first got the trigger, I was really impressed with how sensitive it was out of the box. The lightest of ghost notes are picked up from the center to the edge, and I barely needed to touch the sensitivity settings on the TD50's presets. I only needed to boost the rim gain a little bit to bring the rim trigger's response closer to that of the head. You get great dynamics from this on most standard Roland presets. It worked pretty well straight away on the PD128, the PD125 and 125X, the PDX8 and the Pad 2 presets. The PD128 and 125 presets are obviously made for Roland's center cone designs that are 12 inches in size. This trigger is obviously a 3-cone design, so you can't utilize positional sensing with it. So I dropped down on the menu to the position tab and turned off the positional detection for this preset. I also tried it on the PDX8 setting too, as that's for a side mount trigger pad, and that doesn't utilize positional sensing. And then I also saw it recommended to try the Pad 2 preset on the digital drummer review, and later on with communication with eDrum. To be honest, I got pretty similar results no matter which one of these settings I used. Once you dial in the relevant sensitivity settings, there wasn't a great deal of difference. I could get the full range of the center snare, the rim click or cross stick depending on your settings, and a rim shot, just like I would be able to on any of Roland's stock analog pads. Now, I mentioned further communication with eDrum here because unfortunately I've not been able to get a perfect response with this trigger on my TD50. What I've found is that you get some areas of the head that are hotter and some areas that are colder. Unlike a center cone where you get one small hotspot right in the center that spikes wildly when you hit it, this 3-cone design appears to give you a really responsive center that's about as hot as hitting directly over any of the 3 cones. Now this seems to be because right in the center you're getting the sum of the 3 cones equally picking up the force of your strike. But then as you move out to the edges but in between where the cones sit, you do get noticeably colder areas. As you move towards the cones again, it gets hotter, but you end up basically with this red shape as your hot area. For my playing style, this unfortunately means I was struggling with consistency. I couldn't really find any trigger type that this wasn't happening on. You can dial it down a bit with varying levels of success depending on your playing style. I found that if I turned the sensitivity up a little bit higher than I would prefer, it would level the response out a bit, but of course it was diminishing the dynamic range. So I could close the gap a bit, but I couldn't fully eliminate it. You can also change the dynamic response curve to even it out a little bit more, but you end up in a similar position where your mid-velocity strikes are coming out almost as loud as your high-velocity strikes. So once again, you're kind of messing up your dynamic range a little bit. Unfortunately, I think maybe I've just been spoiled a little bit with the digital snare on the TD50. That responds so evenly that it means that I never have to adjust the way that I play. The dynamic range when I'm using the digital snare is almost as wide as it is on my acoustic snare. So my main backbeat hits usually register at about 3/4 of maximum, and then I've still got headroom to go above that if I need to. I couldn't get that response out of this trigger without the cold spots in those 3 patches on the head. If you're a very consistent player and you pretty much always play right in the center of the head, you'll probably never have this issue. But unfortunately for me, and knowing how I play in a live environment, I wouldn't be able to rely on this trigger for that kind of consistency. So I did speak to eDrum about this. Unfortunately, their testing has been mostly on a TD30 and a Mimic Pro, so they couldn't give me TD50 specific advice for this. But they did share with me this really handy response chart that they drew up. It details their findings with different trigger setups, and it definitely confirms what I've been finding. Personally, I'd say that the numbers are a little bit closer to this for me. 127 in the center and on top of the cones, and maybe around 105 to 110 in the colder spots. This is a little bit too dramatic for me. From communication with eDrum though, I do have to add in that I've been told that this sketch is a rough concept, so the numbers aren't exact by any means, and that 1, 2, 3 area is still considered to be a hot area. But that's generally how the response was for me. Your experience might vary. Also, one thing of note is that I think that the trigger engine has been updated a little bit since the TD30. I have read reports in the past from people who've had no issues with a particular pad on the TD30, but then they've struggled to dial it in on the TD50. In fact, I had a kind of similar issue when I went to the TD50 from the Octapad that I used to use. I don't know exactly why that might be or just how much it would affect anything, but I thought I'd just drop that in case. There's a chance that this might actually trigger a bit more consistently on the TD30. It also seems to be the case that the snare samples on the TD50 react more to velocity spikes than the tom samples do, for example. I used this trigger as a floor tom for a little while and I seemed to be getting much more consistent results. Although the cold spots were still there, it never seemed quite as noticeable using tom samples. Once again, I'm not really quite sure why that is. If you do have a TD50, it seems pretty unlikely that you're going to be replacing your digital snare with an analog pad. So what I would conclude for the TD50 is this. You can get really nice tom responses out of this trigger. So if you were building like an A to E conversion around the TD50 digital upgrade pack, this would make a really good internal trigger for 13 or 14 inch toms. You're going to get really well responding toms with no hotspots using these triggers. It's probably not the cheapest option to do this, but you would get really good results. So jumping ahead about a week or two after buying this trigger, I finally got my Pearl Mimic Pro back from its warranty replacement. So this was naturally the next step in testing. I was advised that the PD125 preset with a boost on the rim gain will be the best starting point, and to be honest, I would agree. After trying a fair few of the different presets and options, I came back to that setting. At first, I was getting kinda similar results to the TD50. I could still feel the difference in those areas across the head, and once again it seemed to be the case that it was mostly apparent on the snare samples. So maybe that's not just a Roland thing and it's more to do with the character of snare drums in general. I'm not really sure, but either way I was about to feel quite disheartened. However, the difference in the areas was nowhere near as pronounced as it was on the TD50. And once I started diving into some of the more unique features from the Mimic Pro's settings, I started being able to really optimize this trigger. Along with other general tweaks, the ability to customize the dynamic curve on the Mimic Pro has really helped even out the head response. Even though I've only tweaked the curves quite subtly, that's actually been enough to iron out the worst of the issue. It's not exactly perfect, but it is much more leveled out when you adjust the dynamics to pinch those mid velocities a little bit. I also played around a little bit with the dynamic slider to find the sweet spot. I was using this trigger inside the snare when I was doing my Pearl Mimic Pro sound expansion video, and as you can see from that footage, it's very articulate. I'm getting good rim and rim shot responses, and there's no obvious spikes where the velocity looks out of line compared to what I'm playing. The only thing I really would say is that I still do have those dynamics a little bit hotter than I normally would. I would say it's probably only replicating about 90 to 95% of the dynamic range I would like. However, that even response is probably a little bit more important for me. Overall, I'm really impressed with how this is working with the Mimic Pro. It hands down beats any of the DIY triggers that I've tried to make for sensitivity, and I would happily take this to a gig and use it with the settings that I'm currently using. I'm going to get into who I think that this would be best for in a moment, but I'd just like to add a couple of points in there before I do. In my communications with eDrum, the 3-cone design was elaborated on a bit more, and I feel it's only fair to share this to give everybody the full picture. The 3-cone design will inherently change the way that the trigger responds, and it was explained to me that of course there will be a few little drawbacks because of the position of the triggers. At the moment, only ATV's trigger algorithm will fully interpret this data correctly and make the adjustments for the trigger response. And that's because their trigger engine was fully designed with this concept in mind from the start. This was something I'd already been considering myself, and it's really unfortunate that I don't have an AD5 anymore to test it on. Of course, I can't say with 100% certainty, but I think that if you used this with an AD5, you would get really good trigger response out of it. And of course, since I spoke to him about that, Roland announced their VAD kits which are using the 3-cone design. So I imagine you could use this trigger with the preset for the 14-inch VAD floor tom and get better results. Hopefully, Roland will update the TD50 and their other modules to support this preset, and if they do, I will revisit this trigger using those settings. Fingers crossed that the Mimic developers also create an optimized preset for either ATV pads or the new Roland VAD pads. Then hopefully we'll be able to eke out that extra 5 to 10% of the responsiveness. So should you buy this trigger? Is it for you? Well, I would recommend this trigger for those people who really can't get on with the hotspots on the center cone design. This trigger makes the center of your head respond way more naturally. I would also highly recommend this to anybody who wants 13 or 14-inch toms, even on Roland modules. As I said before, it's not the cheapest way to achieve this, but if you like the 3-cone design, this trigger offers very good sensitivity and rim response, and it would make a very good addition to your kit. As a snare pad, I would recommend it on the Mimic Pro as long as you're happy with the response that I talked about earlier. And I wouldn't really recommend it as a snare trigger on your TD50. The digital snare will outperform pretty much any other trigger you could make, so why bother? If you were thinking about picking one of these up for a snare pad on a TD30, or or any other Roland module or a 2-box module, I would highly recommend seeking out Digital Drummer's review from their November 2019 edition. They've reviewed it very positively across their test modules, and they can help fill in the blanks that I've not been able to test out myself. And then finally, I'll just give you a quick rundown of the pros and cons. I think that the design choices throughout are brilliant and the build quality is great. I love the fact that it's a really easy installation process and it's completely non-destructive. The general sensitivity on the head and the rim is very good, and eDrum are giving very good customer aftercare and support. The downsides would be that the cold spots can be an issue, depending on exactly what module you're using and what your playstyle is. The cost and the wait time on the order could put some people off depending on your circumstance, and depending on your location there might be import duty because it ships from Europe. So overall I'd say it's a very solid trigger and I'm going to continue to keep using mine. I wish eDrum all the best with their triggers because they've clearly put a lot of work into them and I think they deserve people's support. Hopefully this helps you work out whether or not this trigger is for you. Sorry it took so long to get this review out. The last couple of weeks really swapped around my video schedule. If you enjoyed this review, please pop a like on it and let me know down in the comments what you thought. This is my first review video, so hopefully I've done it justice. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more electronic drum related content, and let me know in the comments what you think of this trigger. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!